on January 8th, 1790, less than a year into his first term, George Washington stood in front of a joint session of Congress in New York City and delivered what would be the first message to the United States Congress on the State of the Union. They didn't call it the State of the Union address then. They called it the first annual message to Congress, but this was the precursor to what we have today. Far different, as you'll see. Of course, they write, this was long before the kind of pomp and circumstance we see at modern State of the Union addresses. There wasn't any mention of honored guests or long peals of politically induced clapping between the president's sentences, none of that. To the likely appreciation of those present, they write, Washington's speech was quite concise. It would be the shortest ever recited by a president, clocking in at a brief 1,089 words, significantly shorter than what most of these people do in modern times. And here he kicks it off. This is the first sentence. He said, I embrace with great satisfaction the opportunity which now presents itself of congratulating you on the present favorable prospects of our public affairs. So he's like, we've gone through quite a bit, and now we have a favorable situation. We can move forward. And in the first session of Congress, we did some good stuff. But here he's going to follow up with some priorities that he's asking them to move on. He said the recent accession. So the first thing he gets to, the recent accession of the important state of North Carolina to the Constitution of the United States, of which official information has been received. So he's celebrating the fact that North Carolina decided to join the Union because they actually did not ratify the Constitution. And for almost a year and a half, they remained an independent republic. They were on their own. And they even had Hugh Williamson serve as a foreign diplomat and he went to New York City and negotiated with members of Congress as a foreign country, basically urging them to get amendments that would make it more palatable for North Carolina to join the Union. And Dave Benner has an interesting short blog post on this, which will be linked to in the show notes. I'll publish that a couple of hours after this live stream is done, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. But Dave points out that during this time, the United States did not attempt to use coercion against the state of North Carolina. They did not view their status as an independent republic as a rebellion or raise an army to force its approval. Instead, Dave writes, peace and mutual friendship characterized the dealings between North Carolina and the United States. And it's very likely, at least my reading of this, Dave probably knows the history a little bit better than I do, but my reading of it, it was because of this peaceful relationship that encouraged North Carolina to get on board. And George Washington celebrated that right off the bat. So then Washington then goes on to outline his priorities. And the first thing that he talks about is national defense, but not in the way that anyone in modern times talks about it. The most important thing to George Washington was a well-armed, well-trained, well-disciplined population. We, the people, are the first line of defense. And here's how he put it. Among the many interesting objects which will engage your attention, that of providing for the common defense will merit particular regard. To be prepared for war is one of the most effectual means of preserving peace. So this is a general, a very famous general, saying like just to be prepared for what might come will allow us to achieve our goal. Our goal, though, is peace. A free people, he said, ought not only to be armed, but disciplined, to which end a uniform and well-digested plan is requisite, and their safety and interest require that they should promote such manufactories as tend to render them independent of others for essential, particularly military supplies. He wanted a well-armed, skilled, trained, disciplined general population, armed up, so you don't have to rely on, well, what so many people thought were the bane of liberty, a large permanent standing army. But he also encouraged manufacturing so that they wouldn't have to rely on others, outsiders, to provide them the tools that they needed to wage war if they had to. So just 10 days later, Secretary of War, they didn't call him Secretaries of Defense back then, Secretary of War Henry Knox sent to George Washington in response to this. So 10 days after the State of the Union, this address, he sent to George Washington a revised plan for the arrangement of the militia. And here's how Knox put it. He said, "It has been my anxious desire to devise a national system of defense adequate to the probable exigencies of the United States, whether arising from internal or external causes. That's a mouthful there. He said, and at the same time erect a standard of Republican magnanimity, independent of and superior to the powerful influences of wealth. So if you just create kind of a military industrial complex, that would fit the latter. But if the people themselves were the first line of defense, as Knox says right here, you've got a different story. And he said an energetic national militia is to be regarded as the capital security of a free republic and not a standing army, forming a distinct class in the community. Now, Washington then went on to request that Congress establish a small army, but also that they give him authorization to deal with current hostilities, violence, warfare with Indian tribes, Indian nations. And a lot of people really skip over this because they don't understand the background. And if you read about Washington's first address here, they'll just say, oh, yeah, he convinced Congress to raise an army. But there was a lot more to it. And he put it this way. I'll get to the background in just a moment. He said the proper establishment of the troops, which may be deemed indispensable, will be entitled to mature consideration. In other words, still deferring to Congress. I think we need to raise some troops, but it's your call. He said there was reason to hope that the pacific measures adopted with regard to certain hostile tribes of Indians would have relieved the inhabitants of our southern and western frontiers from their depredations, but you will perceive from the information contained in the papers which I shall direct to be laid before you. Had a bunch of documents to explain what was going on, some letters, etc., from Virginia, for example, that we ought to be prepared to afford protection to those parts of the Union and, if necessary, to punish aggressors. So here's the background. After taking office in 1789, President Washington was having already to deal with hostilities from some of the Indian tribes, the Indian nations, especially in the Northwest Territory, Virginia and Northwest Territories. You've got Governor Lee, Governor Blunt. Governor Blunt, specifically in the Northwest Territory, was repeatedly asking for military support, military help. So George Washington went to Congress 3 times in 1789, August and September, to ask them to reauthorize troops that the Confederation Congress had previously approved under the Articles of Confederation, but that didn't exist anymore. So Washington held the view that, well, we have to reauthorize this to make it legal under the Constitution. And he also wanted them to authorize him to call up the militia to deal with Indian wars, as Governor Blunt, for example, was asking for support. So it took him 3 times asking. Congress finally came through at the end of September of 1789, but the authorization that they gave him was temporary. It had a sunset date in early 1790, and so here we are in January 1790, and he's asking for a reauthorization. Now, I covered this view of war powers by George Washington under the Constitution in very much detail in an episode in February, War Powers and George Washington. Most people misrepresent almost everything that he did when it comes to war powers in the Constitution. That'll be linked to in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. So anyway, so here it is in his first State of the Union, we'll call it. He's expressly asking for them to reauthorize these temporary measures. And then just days after his address, the House of Representatives responds with this: we regret that the pacific arrangements pursued with regard to certain hostile tribes of Indians have not been attended with that success which we had reason to expect from them. We thought just by not going to war, engaging in more peaceful, passive responses, we'd be able to kind of improve the situation. But we shall not hesitate to concur in such further measures as may best obviate any ill effects which might be apprehended from the failure of those negotiations. Very similar message came the same day from the Senate, which says, we regret that the pacific measures adopted by government with regard to certain hostile tribes of Indians have not been attended with the beneficial effects toward the inhabitants of our southern and western frontiers, which we had reason to hope. And we shall cheerfully cooperate in providing the most effectual means for their protection, and if necessary, for the punishment of aggressors. So Washington is asking for some authority. He got temporary authority. He's going back and saying, I need more. I need you to reauthorize this. And Congress did that weeks later. I guess looks like a couple months later. April 30th, 1790, George Washington signed an act for regulating the military establishment of the United States. Most people pass over the authorization to use force that was given to him, and they just talk about how, well, here they established the army and that's it. But it also gave him the war powers that he asked for. It says, the president is hereby authorized to call into service from time to time such part of the militia of the states, respectively, as he may judge necessary for the purpose aforesaid. That is protecting, it said protecting the inhabitants of the frontiers of the United States. Now, it was only after he got this authorization from Congress that George Washington authorized what is known today as the Harmar Campaign. Again, I covered this in much detail in that episode, War Powers and George Washington, where he repeatedly, when he did not get approval from Congress, he repeatedly told the people asking him to do more, I can't do it. No way. Henry Knox did the same thing. Anyways, back to Mount Vernon, back to George Washington's speech. They point out mountvernon.org. The president went on to outline what he saw as the republic's most important challenges. He argued pointedly that Congress should fund and support efforts to protect the interests of the United States in foreign affairs. He encouraged Congress to consider key domestic issues, including immigration, the establishment of a national currency, and a standard of weights and measures, and the establishment of a post office and a system of education. Now, this is a very common take. You'll find this type of view, especially because Mount Vernon is George Washington's estate, but it also has some, I would say, some misrepresentations, if I'm going to be generous here. Some of it, I think, is just false. First of all, he said nothing about immigration. The word immigration did not come up. Here's how he put it. Various considerations also render it expedient that the terms on which foreigners may be admitted to the rights of citizens should be speedily ascertained by a uniform rule of naturalization. And they did pass a Naturalization Act a while after this because he asked for it. And they're like, this is what we got to deal with. But he wasn't talking about immigration. He was talking about whether or not to naturalize as citizens foreigners who were already there. So that's an important point. Then he also said this: uniformity in the currency, weights, and measures of the United States is an object of great importance and will, I am persuaded, be duly attended to. Now, I could debate whether or not, maybe it's a semantics debate, whether or not George Washington was asking them to establish a national currency, but I'm not going to get too picky on that, but you might actually be interested in reading more about what happened after. On January 15th, just a week after this, Congress then requested Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson to draw up a plan for the uniformity of coins, weights, and measures of the United States. He submitted that to Congress in July of 1790. We did not get a Coinage Act until 1792. And then I would also disagree with the notion that Washington called for the establishment of a system of education. This is just false. He did not say we need to establish a national system of education under the control of Congress, and there's going to be a top-down control like what we have today in the Department of Education, because that's how it sounds. Now, those of us who've read his speech a number of times, and then we know what really happened there, because this is just false. He did emphasize learning, education, knowledge, etc. He said knowledge in every country is the surest basis of public happiness. He said to the security of a free constitution, it contributes in various ways. By convincing those who are entrusted with the public administration that every valuable end of government is best answered by the enlightened confidence of the people, and by teaching the people themselves to know and to value their own rights. So the more that people are educated on the structure of the Constitution and the structure of and what their rights are, where they come from, or natural rights, for example, the better things are going to be under a Constitution. And ignorant people will never be free, as Thomas Jefferson put it. He said to discern and provide against invasions of their rights, to distinguish between oppression and the necessary exercise of lawful authority, between burdens proceeding from a disregard to their convenience and those resulting from the inevitable exigencies of society. So knowledge was very, very important. Learning was very important. He called specifically for, quote, the promotion of science and literature. He did not say we need to establish a national or a congressional-run education system. Instead, I think he basically deferred to Congress to think about the best way to promote and advance a knowledgeable population, which I guess could include saying, we're going to do nothing. He's saying, this is what I think we should consider, but it's up to you. Here's how he put it. Whether this desirable object will be best promoted by affording aids to seminaries of learning already established, by the institution of a national university, or by other expedients, will be well worthy of a place in the deliberations of the legislature. In other words, your call. Now, in the House of Representatives, there was some debate over his recommendation to consider maybe a institution of a national university. It was seen by many as unconstitutional, so they never considered it. But that, I guess we could discuss in another episode. George Washington, again, he concluded here from Mount Vernon, he concluded by addressing two particularly divisive fiscal issues, something we don't get much dealing with today. Establishing the public credit, we know in his farewell address, he said, cherish public credit, use it as sparingly as possible. So he talked about this as well. Here in 1790, establishing the public credit and repaying the public debt. By addressing these topics publicly, he sought to impel Congress to act. There's nothing that helps us get this kind of historical foundational information out to more and more people, more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you support our work here and you want to help us reach and teach more people, you can join us for as little as $2 a month of that dirty government fiat. If you got a couple of bucks, please consider throwing it our way. We also have annual, lifetime, and 5-year options. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope it made you recognize how far things are from the way the founders addressed things under the Constitution. Today, we live under the largest government in history. It couldn't even be remotely close. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you have an awesome weekend and hope to see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.